So today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to have a factoring review. And so instead of actually starting with chapter 5, okay, we're going to go ahead and we're just going to review factoring. And the reason is because it's so important and it will follow us through the rest of the semester. Okay. So first of all, why do we factor? Or what is the purpose of factoring?
Hold on. Give me a minute.
Teachers should not ask us questions coming back from break.
The purpose of factoring is to solve a quadratic equation. Okay, that's why we factor. We use this to solve quadratics. And so the question is, where are quadratic equations used? And we didn't really hit on this when we first learned about factoring, but quadratic equations are used in a lot of places. The first place they're used in science and engineering, a ton. Okay? And the interesting thing is if you ever go to a Husker football game, or if you had in the past, they used to have this physics time where this physics professor would get on and talk about physics with respect to football. They actually used quadratics in one of those. It was really neat. Okay? It's used for paths of projectiles. And so when you think about a projectile, you think about, you know, the olden times, a projectile would be a cannon. Okay, a projectile today would be like a tank projecting, missiles. Not to get all worry on it, everything. Passive projectiles could be a football, a punt of a football. When you hit a baseball, it will do a projectile path, which is in terms of a quadratic equation. Okay. Satellite dishes actually are usually parabolic in shape. Now, granted, they're three-dimensional, but they're still parabolic in shape, and so a quadratic equation can be used to model that. And the interesting thing is wherever they put that tip of that satellite will determine kind of what you're going to get, what signal you're going to receive, if you're going to get the correct signal. And then revenue equations. Revenue equations are like how much a company makes, and basically what you do is you take your cost per product times the amount of products, and that's called the demand. Okay, and so revenue equations are where quadratic equations are used. Okay, so they're actually pretty applicable. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to review, do some basics just to kind of get into the swing of things for second semester here. And so our first instruction is to solve by factoring. And so our first problem is x squared minus 16 equals 0. So we need to review. What do you think you need to do here? Yeah, you can take the square root. So what's the square root of x squared? X. What's the square root of 16? 4. So there's two ways to do this. I could factor it this way. Does anybody remember what goes in each factor? X minus 4 and x plus 4. Okay, if you solve each of those, you'll get two solutions. Your solutions will be what? 4 and negative 4. Very good. Okay. I also saw somebody do this. They said, oh, I've got x squared minus 16 equals 0. And so then I'm going to add 16 to both sides, which is fine. And so you get x squared equals 16. Now, the big important thing to remember when you take the square root here is what? You have to take the positive and negative whenever you take the square root. And that's something to file away for like when you take the ACT. Okay, whenever you take the square root, you take both the positive and the negative. All right, so let's go ahead and look at number 2. Number 2, 5 is not a perfect square, so we can't just jump to a solution. But what can we do in number 2? Divide by 5. Okay, we could divide by 5. That'll work. So if I divide by 5, I get x squared plus 5x equals 0. What can you do now? Take out an x. That's right. Don't divide by x, but take an x out. Now when I take an x out, what do I get? X plus 5. Yep. X times x plus 5. And so my two solutions will be at where? Okay, so the first solution is going to be where x equals 0. Or my second solution will be where x plus 5 equals 0. Now the first one we've already solved, x equals 0. The second one, what do we need to do here? Subtract 5. So when I subtract 5, what do you get x to equal? Negative 5. So your two solutions there are 0 and negative 5. Now you can divide by a number. You cannot divide by a variable. Okay, so when we divided by 5 here, that was fine as long as we didn't put a variable in there. So far, so good? So let's go ahead and look at the following. Now, we've looked at 2 terms. Now we're going to look at 3 terms. So when we have 3 terms and we have 1x squared to start with, okay, this right here tells me that it's going to be a lot easier. Do we remember what we do? Yep. We look at the last term, which is 12. So I'm looking for 2 factors of 12 that add up to 8. What are they? 6 and 2. So then now I work my way back. How do I get a positive 8 from 6 and 2?
X plus 6.
Yep. So x plus 6 times x plus 2. What are my 2 solutions? Negative 6 and negative 2. Remember, if we look at the opposite of those, when you have x plus 6, the opposite of positive 6 is negative 6, and x plus 2, the opposite is negative 2. Okay, the fourth one. 2 factors of what? 28 that do what? Differ by 12. What are they? 14 and 2. Now is when we attach the signs. How do you get a negative 12 from 14 and 2? Negative 14, positive 2. Good. So that will factor to be n minus 14 times n plus 2. My 2 solutions are going to be what? 14 and negative 2. Good. Not too bad? Okay. Oh, no, it's going to skip. There we go. All right, so let's look at number 5. What do you think you should do on number 5?
Distribute the x. Nope, I'll do that.
Why don't you distribute the x? You're correct.
Because, hold on, I got this.
Say it louder. You're right.
Because it was already simplified down.
Because it's already simplified down. That's already in factored form. That is the final step that we had before we went to our solutions, right?
Yeah.
So I can just look at this and say that either x equals 0, x equals what from here? Negative 4, or x equals what from here? 3. So that's actually a fairly easy problem. It's just disguised. It makes you look like you should do more, but you don't. The next problem. What should you do? Divide by 12. Good. So let's go ahead and divide through by 12. Now remember, we can divide by a number. We just can't divide by a variable. So I get x squared plus 3x plus 2 equals 0. So now when I look at the front, I have a 1x squared right here. So that means I can just look at the last number. The last number here is, so 2 factors of 2. Yep. 2 and 1, they add to 3, and you use a?
Positive.
Yep, positive 1, positive 2. So x plus 2 times x plus 1 equals 0. And so your 2 solutions are? Negative 2 and negative 1. Kind of starting to ring a bell now? Okay, the last few. That thing's skipping. Let's look at this next one. So remember, very first thing we look at is that coefficient of x squared. Coefficient of x squared here is not 1. It's 3. We can't get rid of the 3. We can't divide by 3. So do you remember now what we need to do?
No, take 3 times 2.
Take 3 times 2, so 2 factors of 6.
Nice, Jordan.
So now when we take the first times the last, that's our number now that I work backwards from. So 2 factors of 6 that differ by 1. What are they? Two factors of 6 that differ by 1. 3 and 2. Now, how do you get a negative 1 from 3 and 2? Negative 3 and positive 2. Now, this is the one where we have to write it big. Okay, so it's going to be 3x squared minus 3x plus 2x minus 2 equals 0. Okay, so this is the one where we have to write 4 terms. Whenever you have that first number that's not a 1, this is the longer one. What do you do now?
You take out the 3x.
Add like terms.
Yeah, what I need to do here is I need to remember I need to group. I group them into 2s. What do you take out from the first bunch?
The 3x.
3x, and that leaves me with
X minus 1.
x minus 1. What do you take out from the second?
A
A 2. Leaves you with?
2. X minus 1.
Ah, and they match. Because remember, that is going to be one factor. What's your other factor going to be? 3x plus 2. Remember, our other factor is the leftovers. What's on the outside of the parentheses? And so then now, if I solve this, my first solution will be what from this one? 1. Do you remember the nifty little trick we had here for this one?
Nope.
Negative 2/3. For those of you that are wondering, remember it was the opposite of this, divided by the 3. If that confuses you, set it up like this and go through and solve it. Okay? If you can remember the shortcut, great. If you can't, go through and solve it and you'll get there. So 1 and negative 2/3. With that in mind, I want you to try this one for me. Okay, 6x squared minus 7x minus 18. I'll give you a few minutes and then we'll come back and work this one out. Okay, so as you're dividing through and finding, have you found 2 factors that differ by 7?
Nope.
No. You haven't found 2 factors. If you've tried everything, what ends up happening is you can't factor this. So this would be one that would be not factorable. Okay, now, there are 2 other ways that we could solve this, but today we're just talking about factoring. Does anybody remember those 2 other ways? Quadratic formula is one. What's another one?
Where you take the half of the...
Take the half. What was that process called?
Finding the square.
Close, not finding the square. Completing the square.
Oh.
So what we would do if we couldn't factor is we could complete the square and use the quadratic formula. But we will focus on those later. So let's look at this last one. Okay, 4x squared plus 5x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, I'll let you go ahead and work on that one. So a lot of you I saw on the right track, what you did is you took 4 times 1, 2 factors of 4 that add up to 5, you got 4 and 1. So then a lot of you got to this step right here. When you have 4 terms, remember you group it. What you can do is take out a 4x here. You're left with x plus 1. From the second, you can't take anything out. But remember, when you can't take anything out, we always take out a 1. So then now what we need to do is we need to go ahead and look. We have our terms matched here, so I get x plus 1. On the outside, I get 4x plus 1. So my 2 solutions, here I get negative 1, here I get negative 1/4. Okay. So you've got 3 of those on your worksheet today. So your assignment then for tomorrow is to complete this factoring worksheet. Okay, I've handed it out. You have a lot of time right now that you can get done with it, and you won't have any homework then. So.